We are pleased to have Dr. Tushar Mehta. We're so happy that he was able to join us today. He is a practicing physician in family medicine and addiction medicine and is currently an emergency medicine physician. Dr. Mehta also participates in international health projects, having formerly volunteered on an annual basis in rural India and now works with an NGO in Haiti. Dr. Mehta also co-founded Plant-Based Data. It's an online database that collects and organizes the most important academic and institutional literature regarding the impact of a plant-based diet on health, the environment, food security, including the role of animal agriculture and creating zoonotic pandemics. So we are very happy he's able to join us. Please welcome Dr. Tushar Mehta.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to zoom through well, I'm going to go a little bit quickly because I have a lot of slides here. There's a lot of ground to cover, okay? And obviously, we're going to talk about the ecological health, zoonotic risks of poultry and, sort of chicken and bird consumption, okay? Why is it a conundrum for us? Because people are often telling us that, oh, I don't eat red meat, I eat chicken instead, etc. And that's a bit of a conundrum. And they have these pictures of these terrible pictures of chickens eating chickens. I mean, advertising. I just don't get that. But so there's a little bit about me. Thank you for the introduction. And there's plant-based data. I hope you will all visit the website and share the website as a resource regarding scientific information about health, environment, zoonosis, etc., economics, when it comes to plant-based foods compared to animal products. And you'll find a lot of, it'll save you time in your literature searches and help you understand the actual information that's out there from a scientific perspective, okay? Just another push for one of our recent publications regarding these myths about regenerative grazing. But we're going to talk about the myth or the conundrum about this, switching to chicken as a healthy or ecological choice, okay? So we're going to look at the big picture about animals on Earth that people farm and look at regarding poultry birds and chickens as well, which is the biggest group among poultry birds, the ecological health, zoonotic risks thereof, okay? So some of my friends in Haiti, and I'm going to talk about people, okay? This is going to give a little bit of background here. Now, let's talk about the world population. There's, I always start with this, okay? And you kind of get the drift why. But there's 7.8 billion people on the planet right now. The population grows at 1%, which means we add 1 billion people about every 10 to 12 years to the planet. And we're going to get to 10 billion by 2050. By the end of the century, maybe those numbers should be a little bit revised, this 12 to 15, in accordance with revised UN estimates. But we can have, less or more than 10 billion people, but a small change in growth rate could have big fluctuations in actual population at that time. And so we have a huge number of people who we want to feed ethically, sustainably, happily, and need a good existence on this planet. But at the present time, there's so much terrible inequality. These are numbers before COVID-19. 800 million people living in extreme poverty, 4 billion people in moderate poverty, and these numbers have increased. And congratulations if you make more than $32,000 US per year, you're part of the 1%. And 82% of all new wealth goes to 1%. So there's this horrible inequality. Now, if you look at human populations, a long time ago, 10,000 years ago, humans were one of many different animals that roamed the earth, and we were just less than 1% of the total biomass of land animals. But now, we make about 1/3 of the total biomass of land animals, and our livestock makes up about 2/3 of the total biomass. Wild animals making up between 1% and 4%, depending on the research that you're looking at. But that's kind of within the same range, a similar range. We outweigh all wild animals on Earth by this massive distorted amount. And so that tells you what's going on Earth. Now, just looking at chickens themselves, this one species of animals who's bred into existence by humans, they're not a natural animal that's out in the wild, um, they are 3 times, they outweigh all wild birds, depending on how you define species, 15 to 20,000 types of wild birds by 3 times. We got to appreciate the scale of our presence on Earth and these industrial agriculture systems as well. Wild vertebrate populations on Earth have dropped by about 70% from 1970 to 2017. Very, very rapid drop in the population of all wild animals, while humans have pretty much doubled, as you know, and same goes for our livestock. These are radically fast trends, okay? We've changed about 75% of the land-based environment of the Earth and 2/3 of the marine environments, okay, using about 3/4 of fresh water. Now, of the 75% land that's altered by humans, we use pretty much 40 to 50% of the total Earth's non-frozen surface for agriculture. And most of that is for animal agriculture. The biggest share going to grazing, okay, because grazing takes up the most amount of land. That's ruminant animals, you know, goats and cattle and so forth. But half of the Earth's crops go to feeding animals. And amongst the, and aside from ruminants, there are animals with a single stomach. We call them monogastrics, and that's pigs and chickens. And they are, you know, fed, you know, so these animals are fed so many of the crops, and a lot of that goes to these monogastric animals, okay? Now, here's good information from our world in data showing that most of the protein that we consume, actually 60% of it, more than 60% of it, comes from plant protein, which uses only a fraction of the Earth's agricultural land. Okay, so that's interesting. And the world's biomass, our deforestation, we've cut the world's plant matter by half through our deforestation. We've deforested about half the Earth so far. Okay. And in terms of terrestrial livestock, we slaughter 70 to 80 billion animals per year, closer to 80 billions right now. That's over 2,000 animals per second, and it's mostly chickens. There's these other monogastric animals, as I mentioned, and ruminants. Okay. So there's this huge biodiversity loss and extinction that's going on, mentioned in one of the previous slides. Okay, and about 1 million species are threatened. Okay, this includes plants, animals, insects, all kinds of all kinds of beings. Okay, and extinction of ecosystems. And animal agriculture is one of the biggest causes, but it's not the only biggest cause. Some people like to paint it as such, and some people like to exclude it, but it's amongst many other causes that I've listed there in terms of our population, our land use change, fragmentation, material economy, climate, roads, everything that is that is impacting the environment. And we want to feed everybody sustainably, as I mentioned before, and this is difficult. If we switched to entirely plant-based agriculture, we could feed an additional 4 billion people just using existing land, just by growing plant-based foods on existing land and having greater efficiency. Okay. And what we have is this type of ecological genocide that we're experiencing on Earth. Okay. Now, there's a concept called feed conversion ratio. To grow an animal that people are going to slaughter and eat, you have to feed that animal. And as you know, we don't, eat protein and just automatically incorporate it into our body. We metabolize part of it. Part of it is lost as we grow. And it takes 3 to 6 kilograms of plant protein to grow 1 kilogram of chicken flesh that somebody may consume later on. And 6 to 8 kilograms for pigs and much more for cattle and other ruminants. And you can see milk and eggs are sort of in line with the more efficient side, right? As are the most efficient farmed fish. Not all farmed fish are that, or insects are super efficient. People think that these animals are very efficient, but they're not as efficient as people think they are. Okay. And this remarkable efficiency, and I think Kyle alluded to this, is through this breeding that has gone on over centuries, but especially in the current in the modern times, since the Industrial Revolution. We've been genetically manipulating our animals, and here's the example of chickens, through breeding. Breeding is a form of genetic manipulation, okay? Not just GMO, what we talk about direct gene modification, that's another form that's more contemporary, but breeding itself is a form of genetic manipulation that humans have engaged in. And we've grown chickens, or we've evolved artificially our chickens to grow in such a way that it's completely abnormal for them to grow so fast and so big. Okay. Not only are they larger than they were before, but they grow to that size very quickly. And that's how we achieve this tremendous efficiency of feed conversion ratio at the expense of the chicken's well-being. Okay. So why do people say eat chickens instead of cows? For environmental reasons, right? Well, cattle and ruminants compared to farmed birds, as we showed in this previous slide, are, they're more efficient. Birds are more efficient than the cattle. Cattle are less efficient. Cattle and ruminants produce methane, which is worse for climate change. There's the feed conversion ratio. That because of this, they take more land, more deforestation, more water. We use more farmland to grow their feed. We use more pasture for their grazing, and pasture is not natural. Pasture is an alteration of the natural environment. Even if it was a prior grassland, grazing an animal changes that grassland and impacts the species there. And there's this whole myth of regenerative grazing where people say that, oh, grazing is like storing carbon in the earth and everything like that, which it's not. I have a whole lecture on that, which you can check out. So when people say that eating chickens, eating chicken, I'm putting chicken in quotation marks because they use it as a noun, which it shouldn't be used as that. But it's better compared to what? People are comparing them to ruminants, right? But that's the key thing. When we talk about what's better and what's worse, we have to talk about what are you comparing, A to B. Okay, that's what we need to talk about. So that's the key concept in terms of the benefits and harms of food, especially nutrition and environments. For example, you can say that smoking is good for you compared to cocaine. That doesn't mean smoking is necessarily healthy. It's just a healthier option than cocaine, but there may be another healthier option, which is not to smoke at all or use cocaine, right? And so we're going to talk about why legumes and whole grains, the main protein sources, plant-based protein sources, are better than eating, chicken meat and poultry birds. Okay, so as we mentioned, half the world's crops are fed to animals, right? And if you're gonna need to feed, let's say, 3 to 4 kilograms of protein to chickens to get 1 protein back that somebody may consume, you're going to use more land. You're going to use more water. You're going to use more pesticides, herbicides. You're going to use more antibiotics, which you're not really using for plant-based agriculture at all. You're going to use more fertilizers. There's going to be more greenhouse gas emissions as compared to just eating the optimal plant foods. Okay, and we talk about deforestation related to cattle, but it's also related to monogastrics, right? We're going to need more land and cause more deforestation or occupy previously forested land with our farms that feed animals, right? And there's a food security issue. We're transferring crops from the global poor to the global rich when people feed animals and then eat those animals, rather than having more plant-based foods that have good quality protein that can be fed directly to humans. Okay, and even in the Amazon, it's not just being cut down for cattle. Some of the soy produced there is going to use as feed for poultry and monogastric animals as well. Okay, so what about this idea of backyard and traditional farm chickens? Are they more efficient than factory farms? Yes. People's backyard chickens, as you mentioned, there are ethical issues, but people talk about the environmental side, and they do eat some foraged foods, but still they are usually fed grains as well. So it still is going to take grains that could otherwise be human feed. These animals are going to run around, they're going to burn a lot of calories, which means they're going to burn through some of their protein, et cetera, and they're going to be less efficient, going to take more feed. If people have this idea that we want to raise organic animals, well, the organic food takes more land, takes more water, that's less efficient. Or if you want to use heritage breeds, there's a further loss in efficiency because they're not bred to grow as fast and as big, okay, with a lower amount of feed. So All of these things decrease the efficiency of growth and therefore have a relative higher environmental impact. And there's also these things like killing predators around all the places where you do farming, and that has a big environmental impact. Okay. And what if I just eat the eggs? Remember, there's that same similar feed conversion ratio of 3 to 4 kilograms. Now, when I'm talking about these 3 to 4 kilograms or these efficient feed conversion ratios, I'm talking about the most efficient scenarios in, let's say, more developed countries. If you go to other places, they may be less efficient, all right? So they'll have a higher impact on the things, on the parameters we mentioned. Okay, so again, I'm drilling in this concept that if we eat the optimal plant-based proteins, especially our our pulses, our legumes, soy foods, etc., there's and as well as whole grains, it's a direct win in terms of efficiency. There, okay, and and just a note, like we're talking from a first world country perspective, right? If we automatically expect that people in subsistence areas of the world are going to switch around their eating habits and become vegan all of a sudden, that's a very difficult thing. But in the more developed areas of the world or moderately developed areas of the world, most people do have the potential of changing food systems and increasing the plant-based protein consumption for sure. Okay, that's the majority of the world population, really. Okay, so I just mentioned this. Right, when we're having this inefficiency in terms of feed conversion ratio, we're using more land. So there's the land use, food security issues, water usage, and climate change as well. This is a good graph from Our World in Data, looking at the different climate impacts of various different animals produced for food. And you can see that on the oops, what's going on here? On the ruminant animals are having the biggest impact, but then our dairy products and so forth lesser. And here we have what they call poultry meat and eggs, but that is far less efficient than soybeans, peanuts, groundnuts or peanuts, other pulses, peas, nuts. These plant-based proteins are far more efficient from a greenhouse gas perspective. But remember, we're not just looking at greenhouse gases. We also want to look at land use, water use, etc. So if soybeans look a little bit worse here, they're actually still probably one of the most ecological foods that are out there. Okay, the same kind of chart produced differently, showing some different parameters. That there's a spectrum of efficiency for these foods when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. But if you look at the most efficient and least efficient of all these foods, the optimal plant foods really nail it. Okay, and what do we do with all the saved land? We want to rewild the land. Okay, we want to take farmland that we save by growing plant foods that people can eat, instead of taking plant foods, feeding them to animals, and then eating the animals. You save a lot of land by directly eating plant foods, and we can allow land to rewild. And remember those biodiversity numbers that I was giving you, the rates of extinction and everything like that. This is the thing that's most badly needed, is to do rewilding. Now let's talk about health. A lot of people say, well, I just don't eat red meat, I just eat chicken. But sure, yes, processed meat and red meat are worse for your health than eating the flesh of poultry birds. There's worse all-cause mortality, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity, dementia. Like everything is kind of worse when we eat the red and processed meat. But again, compared to what is our question? Okay. Are we comparing just to poultry, comparing chickens to beef or to processed meat? Why don't we compare them to plants? And looking at these studies here, here's a recent study showing that when people are eating, for every 30 grams of poultry meat consumed per day, in higher amounts, there's an 8% increase in heart disease, in ischemic heart disease, right? 14% increase in diabetes, diverticular disease, gallbladder disease, even things like arthritis get worse. Okay, and if you're not adjusting for body weight, in this group of studies here, in this group part of data, they're sort of adjusting for body weight, which kind of unfairly makes the poultry look a little bit better than it than it actually is. It makes it look less worse. But there's other heart disease and other problems that also occur there when you don't adjust for weight. Okay. Now, looking at this study here, meat intake and cancer risk. Just after a short follow-up, very large group of people here, we see that red meat is worse for colorectal cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, et cetera, for every 50 grams increased intake per day. But poultry intake is also associated with certain types of cancers, melanoma, surprisingly, but more commonly what we know of from other data as well, that there's an increase in prostate cancer and certain types of like lymphomas and whatnot that are there, increased due to poultry consumption. So compared to plant-based foods, it's not as good, right? And from the Nurses' Health study, again, for when we're substituting plant protein for different types of animal protein, in terms of all-cause mortality here, there's a 6% benefit for every 3% of energy that's substituted. And regarding eggs, and I'll start talking about eggs now, there's a 19% benefit, okay? Now remember, these numbers are fuzzy. It could vary a little bit from this. These give you ballpark estimates because there's always some variation. The study doesn't give you a totally accurate number, but it shows you that there's a bigger impact in terms of eating eggs when you compare to eating plants, okay? And when you look at the increasing amount of plant protein consumption, you get mortality benefits. When you eat more plants, you get less death, okay? And another 21 paper, and I'm just going to again highlight the eggs here in terms of all-cause mortality. Okay, that's one of the most important measures, like how much people die after eating foods. One of the strongest signals was from consumption of eggs. Egg consumption in terms of health is as bad, it seems, as processed meat, red meat, and all those things. So when people eat eggs, it's one of the worst things for people's health. Okay, and there's some increased in dementia and mortality for eating animal products. Now, in this particular study, it looks a little like it's kind of decreased for eggs and poultry, maybe because they're, one of the major comparisons there is being compared to red and processed meat more as a baseline diet. But again, when you're looking at the eggs, the increased cardiovascular mortality is showing up quite clearly. And there's again, and I have a wrong thing here. That's belongs somewhere else. But and again, when you're eating more plant-based foods, you're getting a much decreased mortality from these types of causes, including all-cause mortality. So again, now let's talk about zoonosis. We talked about environment. We talked about health. I was going to check my time a little bit here. And remember again, this whole 80 billion animals bred and slaughtered per year, mostly chickens. Now, in terms of zoonoses, why are these zoonoses, such as the current pandemic, why are they happening in the first place? And the main thing is that we have abundant different biodiversity of our wild animals. Even though they're small in number, they're very biodiverse. They contain innumerable different kinds of viruses, but usually those viruses are actually benign when they're staying within their own populations and within the migration patterns that are natural to those animals, those wild animals. And they have co-evolved with those animals, mostly in not harming those animals. Okay, they're mostly benign to the animals where they normally reside. However, these animals and interface with our livestock and interface with humans, because humans have now spread all across the world. We've taken over most environments. We have livestock, which are everywhere, who are everywhere, okay, and infiltrating and interfacing with nature. And there's a contact between wild animals and livestock that's been going on for centuries. And many of our traditional diseases have come from wild animals to livestock to humans. So these viruses get from wild animals into livestock, and then within livestock, who are now kept in unnatural conditions, very cramped conditions, they have not co-evolved to be in those conditions. These viruses spread like wildfire amongst our livestock, which are kept in so high numbers in close proximity. There is mutations amongst these viruses happening all the time. And in nature, a bad mutation that would be harmful to the animal usually will die out because it's going to kill off its animal, it's going to die out. But in the animal agriculture settings, when so many animals are congregated together, harmful mutations may kill the animal, but easily spread to other animals within the farm setting. This happened traditionally in smaller farms that occurred throughout the centuries, but much more with our massive animal agriculture of the modern age. So we get this high number of mutations occurring with these animals, and then some of these mutations can come back and affect humans. Sometimes humans are directly going after animals in the wild and acquiring viruses too. That happens in cases like HIV. So there's a lot of literature out there. I just showed you 2 papers from 2012 talking about this whole process and talking about future pandemic risk. And lo and behold, we have the current pandemic, and people knew we're going to have it. There's so many people who are saying, here's the process. If we continue with our massive animal agriculture and our infiltration into the natural world and destroy the environment and infiltrate the environment, we're going to acquire more viruses. These viruses are going to get more mutations through our own farmed animals, and we're going to end up with more diseases. And pretty much the current pandemic was very predictable. Now, looking at influenza A specifically is important because influenza A is originally a virus that resides in poultry birds. Well, not poultry birds, but in waterfowl, okay, wild waterfowl. It's a gastrointestinal virus, which is naturally found with these animals, generally doesn't harm them, may have an ecological role. But as we domesticated birds, and some of these birds acquired our these viruses from the wild, and they spread amongst the farmed animals. We had these mutation processes occurring, and you had something like the Spanish flu that happened in 1918 that killed 40 million people worldwide, maybe more. And so many people, a third of the world's population infected. And then there's these other flus that killed like 1 million here, a couple of million people there. There's the swine flu of 2009, which killed about maybe up to 500,000 people around the world. And we're every year when we get the flu shot, we're actually protecting ourselves mainly from influenza A, which is again yearly coming from farmed birds and spreading into humans. Every year we get our flu shot because of this. All right. And here are papers that talk about the whole process of how from wild animals to our domesticated animals and mutations and transmission from one to the other and so forth and spread across the globe. And how that when we mix animals together on our different farms, you have more genetic recombination and higher chances of a bad virus coming out that can affect humans. And it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when, because periodically we're going to be getting more pandemics coming from animal agriculture. And because these, pigs and especially chickens are the most populous of, of farmed animals, we have the highest risk from these animals. And especially a new variant of influenza could be as dangerous or quite likely much more dangerous variant can come compared to COVID-19, all right? And these are just examples of viruses that people may not know come from animal agriculture, okay? And all right, and I have a podcast about that too. So the main points here is don't be lulled by comparing poultry products to just red and processed meat. We should be comparing, we should be looking at all the different impacts of the eating the meat or eggs of poultry birds and breeding them in large numbers. And perhaps compared to ruminants, there is a lesser health or environmental impact, but not compared to plant-based foods, okay? And there's ecological impacts, there's food security and food justice impacts, there are health impacts, and definitely the zoonosis impacts are, and future risk probably exceeds that of breeding the other animals, such as cattle and ruminants, so in that case, it's worse, okay? And our comparison is whole food plant-based. Remember, there's a lot of junk foods out there for vegans and people are eating more plant-based. Those are generally not healthy. And there's good information coming out showing now that, a lot of these foods that are plant-based but highly processed are actually just as bad as animal products. So I really encourage people to go for whole food plant-based. And I want to see everyone thrive on a healthy diet, everybody out there. and it's really about the whole food plant-based in a scientific way, you know, getting your B12, etc., and looking at those parameters. Okay, you can check out one of my lectures on that. The Eat Lancet, I gotta give them some credit because here's a great project. They're not vegans or, you know, all just running this project. It's scientists that come from the general population. Okay, and this is the biggest sort of nutrition guide on the earth, and they're really emphasizing plant-based proteins and whole food plant-based diet overall for the benefit of health and the environment. And of course, you know, they haven't completely excluded animal-based foods, but they've given it such a small role, and they explicitly say that you don't have to have them. You know, those are optional, but the plant-based proteins are a must. Okay, and so that's fantastic. Here's again another flash at my website, Plant-Based Data. Please check it out. We have some talks there and recorded lectures. Shout out to Greta, and that's pretty much it. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen there, and so I think that we can have a little bit of time for Q&A. How are we doing for time here, guys?
Oh, you're good. We have some time for Q&A. So
Okay.
if anyone has questions, here, let me get my video back on so you can see me. That was wonderful, Dr. Tushar. Thank you so much. It was very insightful. So much good information. And so if anyone has questions, we can maybe put them in. There was one that was just about the protein conversion and if you, where you could maybe find that, is that on your plant-based data website? I don't think it is, but maybe where you could find that, the protein conversion information.
Yeah, there's many different papers who talk about this, which talk about this issue. And they have slightly different numbers, so you have to compare and contrast. I put those numbers there in favor of animal agriculture. Okay, so those are the best numbers you can get. You know, nobody from the meat industry or pro-meat person can tell me that I've exaggerated those numbers, because I've used the ones that are most favorable to the meat industry, actually. Okay, and yeah, so there's papers in plant-based data that talk about that. You can find them on the summaries there. Look just for, you know, you look at the summaries and in the environmental reference list, and look for the, you know, search the term conversion, and you'll find some papers. There's a website called A Well-Fed World. I'm on the board of directors of A Well-Fed World. They have a nice summary of feed conversion ratios on A Well-Fed World website as well. So those are some of the resources you can use. But if you want to dig into the academic papers, we have them on plant-based data.
Wonderful. All right. I'm looking and reading and stuff, so I didn't catch those websites. If anybody wants to put those in the chat, A Well-Fed World, I think it's just awellfedworld.org, I'm pretty sure. And what was the other one you said?
Just Google it. It's plant-based data. I think you can find there. There needs to be more research on feed conversion ratios. Unfortunately, there's not enough emphasis on this concept when people talk about environmental issues, because the environmental movement is behind when it comes to understanding the impact of animal agriculture, and also we have to be careful about looking at literature that comes from the animal agriculture industry. They play little tricks to make the feed conversion ratios look better. For example, just to grow the weight of a chicken, you may have to feed 1.7 times the chicken's weight, which makes it look like a feed conversion ratio that's about, you know, 60 or 70%, makes it look like a very good feed conversion ratio. But really, people are going to remove so many of the parts of that chicken and only have a smaller amount of edible portion. And that's what you really have to factor in terms of the true feed conversion ratio. How much protein are you feeding, and how much protein do you actually get out that somebody will eat? And, you know, the literature doesn't do a great job of exploring this and delineating this, but it's one of the things that I wish people did more research on. And there's also good evidence that, you know, through this breeding and genetic manipulation of chickens, people have achieved this enormous efficiency. Thinking of like how you can get the maximum efficiency, you know, feed 3 kilograms of protein and get 1 kilogram protein back. There's no other animal that really does that. Like humans are nowhere close to that. Natural animals usually aren't that close, very few, but there's a plateau. Further genetic manipulation is not going to achieve greater efficiency, except for the big technological jump of cultured cellular clean meat. That will make the enormous jump there.
Yeah, so okay, we have a lot of questions and comments coming in. Once a person said that there should be an applause button. That's absolutely true. So
Thank you.
at the end of the presentations. Someone else mentioned something about not demonizing the plant-based meats and dairy that's coming out, because it's so important for the transition to a vegan world, a vegan diet. And, of course, I think that we all agree that we need these products. We want these products. They're going to save animals. It's something, though, to do in moderation and to have the majority of your diet be
Exactly. I'm not against these, these vegan junk foods. I mean, I eat some of them too. It's just that we have to remember that we want to go for the healthiest available foods most of the time, have a smaller proportion of these junk foods. And even when you're looking at some of these things, like for example, if you're looking at the transition foods like plant-based meats, there are some plant-based meats that have 3 times the sodium per, let's say, 10 grams of protein than others. Some of them have like double the fat than the protein. And then there's others that have like half the fat and very low amounts of sodium. So we have to get good at selecting which one of these are better, and go for those ones. And those ones are really good too. They're some of the best plant-based meats. So, I mean, I eat some of them, but we want to get good at delineating which are the best of the lot. And still remember, I know some vegans who just only eat junk food, right? We don't want that. We want to get mostly whole foods and then use some of these things here and there, right?
Yeah, if they want to do that, I don't know, but yes, you're right. It's the best. Okay, cool. So let's move on. Actually, Rachel, you had a question. Do you want to maybe read your question? And since you are able to do it visually and on video?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I was wondering something that I've been getting asked a lot, and I failed to find the perfect, short, easy response to it. Is what do you do when people say, yes, industrial cow agriculture is very harmful for the climate and the environment, but we need regenerative ag, and it's going to save the world. So the cow ag, if used in a regenerative way, is going to save the world and is not a climate problem response.
Right. It's a little bit difficult to encapsulate in a very short answer, but basically it's fake news. These are industry studies that are and industry promoted things about storing carbon in the ground and all this kind of things. There's multiple problems with this whole thing. Generally, cattle take up the most amount of resources, and when you graze cattle, they take an even more amount of resources. And we're not just looking at climate here, we're looking at land use change. That's one of the biggest parameters. People in the environmental movement, they focus in on climate, which is a big problem, but it's not the only problem. People make it out as if it's the majority problem, but it's actually one big problem amongst many other big problems. Land use change is a very, very critical issue worldwide. And this is the biggest issue about land use change. It's not a climate solution in terms of rewilding the land would actually store the most carbon, far more than any kind of improved agriculture. These guys ignore or minimize the methane emissions from cattle, which are greater when you have grazing. But we have a very good article on plant-based data and a whole section devoted to this. So we have a few lectures, a couple of lectures, and an article on plant-based data devoted to the whole myth of regenerative grazing. So you should please check that out.
And on the Hope for the Animals podcast.
Yes.
I had Dr. Tushar on our podcast, so we talked all about it. So we kind of broke it down. I mean, it's not a quick answer either, but you get a bigger picture, and maybe you can try to funnel down and find that quick answer from all that information.